Good evening. My name is Audrey Huang, and I'm a frontline bookseller at Belmont Books in Belmont, Massachusetts. I'm delighted and honored to be in conversation tonight with Vaishnavi Patel, the author of Kaikeyi. Belmont Books is located in Belmont Center, and we are open for in-person shopping and online shopping at Boston.com. And we just had our 5th birthday. Thank you for Boston.com Book Club for having me, and thank you so much to Paul Swiden, the owner of Silver Unicorn Books in Acton, Massachusetts. What's great about this book club is that not only does it introduce readers to New England authors through the setting, through their books, but it also introduces you readers to various indie bookstores in the area. The truth is, when one indie thrives, we all thrive. Now some basic housekeeping issues. The chat is disabled, but the Q&A is open for questions. This is a virtual event that will be recorded and posted on YouTube after the event. Now on to our event itself. Vaishnavi Patel is a recent law school graduate with a focus on constitutional law and civil rights. She likes to write at the intersection of Indian myth, feminism, and anti-colonialism. Her short stories can be found in the Dark in 87 Bedford's historical fantasy anthology, and along with a forthcoming story in Helios Quarterly. She was also a Pitch Wars Class of 2019 mentee. Vaishnavi grew up in and around Chicago, and in her spare time, she enjoys activities that are almost stereotypically Midwestern: knitting, ice skating, drinking hot chocolate, and making hot dish, which sounds way too warm right now. And this is what the New York Times Book Review had to say about Kaikeyi. Patel writes with a graceful, measured elegance. Reading the book feels like a stroll through high halls and fragrant gardens as Kaikeyi tells her own story in counterpoint to this epic. Please join me in welcoming Vaishnavi, joining us from New Haven, Connecticut.
Hi everyone, it's so great to be here. And confession, I actually had hot chocolate earlier today because I'm a fiend. But yeah, I think the bio said it all. I just graduated law school. I published Kaikeyi in April, and I hope to keep writing about Indian myth, feminism, and colonialism. I'm so excited to be here to chat with you today about Kaikeyi. And before we get into the discussion, we thought it would be helpful to share a short video I put together with my publisher about the epic that Kaikeyi is based on, the Ramayana, and a little bit about why I wrote Kaikeyi. So here's the video. The Ramayana is one of the most famous Indian epics. It tells the story of Ram, a god reincarnated as the prince of a great kingdom. Just as he is about to be crowned king, Ram is banished from his home by his stepmother and sets off on a 14-year exile, accompanied by his brother and his wife Sita. Most of the Ramayana follows the kidnapping of Sita by the demon king Ravan and the war Ram wages to save her. He travels across ancient India on his quest, amassing allies and ultimately defeating the demon king. He returns to his kingdom triumphant and takes his place on the throne. So, who is Kaikeyi in all of this? Well, remember the stepmother who banishes Ram and essentially spurs the entire epic? That's Kaikeyi. In the Ramayana, Kaikeyi is portrayed as spiteful and jealous, exiling Ram so that her own son can be king. She banishes Ram despite claiming to love him as her own son, and doesn't seem to care about the consequences of her decision. Essentially, Kaikeyi has come to be viewed as the classic petty and poisonous female villain. But I always felt there was something missing in this characterization of Kaikeyi. Before that point in the epic, Kaikeyi is described as a courageous warrior and an excellent queen. I wanted to explore why a woman like that might make the decision to tear her family apart, rather than simply accepting she did so out of irrational jealousy. This novel gives Kaikeyi a voice, imagining her life from childhood to her fateful decision to banish Ram, a decision that immortalized her in Indian mythology. And while you'll meet all the characters mentioned here and more, don't expect a tale that follows the story of the epic. After all, this novel isn't about the legendary prince. It's about the evil stepmother.
So I'm sure it's no surprise that I love this book. I love that it's this feminist retelling and it fully drew out who Kaikeyi really was versus just being this evil stepmother. But before we get into that, can you tell us about your research project on this research process on this book?
Yeah, so Kaikeyi was actually born out of me doing research on the topic of Kaikeyi because I was so interested in her from when I was a kid and I heard my mom and my grandma discussing this that I kept finding myself looking her up, looking up things about her, eventually, looking in translations for mentions of her. So I was trying to piece together her story by just researching the epics before I ever decided to write this book. Once I sort of decided that there was a story here that I might want to tell, I got a lot more serious and systematic about my research. So I read a actual translation from cover to cover, which is like thousands of pages, but it's also epic poetry. So once you get in the rhythm of it, it feels a lot faster than reading like thousands of pages of prose. Um, I read other translations, but like portions of them because I didn't have it in me to read thousands of pages like thousands of times because there are genuinely hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of the Ramayana. But I also read a lot of scholarly articles about other versions of the Ramayana, about the portrayal of women in the Ramayana, what that meant in ancient India, what sort of values that were trying to be portrayed, as well as just trying to figure out what the spread of the story had been and the meaning behind the different variations. Um, I did most of this research sort of before starting or while I was outlining the story. And then as I started writing the story, I realized that I needed to know not just about the epic itself, which at that point I had a really solid understanding of, but about the ancient worlds that Kaikeyi inhabits, which I knew almost nothing about because in the Ramayana they have like flying chariots and, 10-headed demons and I was like, okay, but like, what did they eat on a daily basis? And so I ended up doing a lot of research into just like ancient India, ancient Indian political structure, things like that. I love research. I'm a huge nerd, so it was actually a really fun part of the process. Um, but I think the research really informed a lot of the story that you see on the page.
Now, how many years of research do you think you actually did? Like, did you start while you're, I know you started research probably before you were in law school, but when
Mhm.
this intensive research, as well as reading multiple versions of this epic, was that all
Yeah.
in law school too? Because, there's really no reading when you are in law school, right?
Yeah, so I started drafting Kaikeyi my first semester of law school. But the summer before law school, I essentially had off because I quit my job a few months in advance. And so that summer was really like the summer of the Ramayana, the summer of Kaikeyi. Like I was just reading this stuff everywhere, looking stuff up everywhere. And then in law school, I was like fortunate to go to a law school that doesn't do first semester grades. So I definitely was like neglecting law school for writing this book sometimes, which was totally worth it to me because I think I ultimately learned what I needed to learn, but I had a lot more fun writing Kaikeyi. Um, so yeah, I think it was sort of both and.
So, as you're doing all this research, did you find that there are a lot of consistencies as you were reading various versions of the epic, such as, like, I think the length of exile might have been a little different than what actually came out in Kaikeyi? And did you also find that happened? Did you find that in your research itself?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the inconsistencies or seeming inconsistencies between Kaikeyi and the Ramayana are actually alternate versions. For example, there is a like parenthood reveal that I won't spoil, but that is present in several versions in Southeast Asia. In other cases, like the length of the exile, it's 14 years in the epic because 14 years was a religiously and socially relevant number. Like at 14 years uh, of exile, Ram would have essentially abdicated his claim to the throne or would have been considered dead. And so that was Kaikeyi's purpose in exiling him for 14 years. Versus in my book, her purposes are a little different. So I ended up changing the exile period to match that. So there were like some little, well, at least to me at the time, they seemed small details that I changed to sort of match up with like the purposes behind what was in the text because Kaikeyi is it takes some significant changes from the epic. Even though the characters end up in a lot of the same places, they get there in such a different way. They didn't want to like misrepresent the story and its meanings by borrowing elements that were no longer appropriate.
I suspect that there probably was not as much information in on Kaikeyi herself, because this epic is not about her, but it's about Ram. How how did you find more information about our beautiful anti-hero?
So there's not that much about Kaikeyi in the Ramayana, but what I actually discovered was that there's more than we're told. Like in the versions I grew up hearing about, seeing on TV, reading in my comic books, Kaikeyi sort of like shows up to save Dashrath's life, or she um she
That
doesn't show up
battle
to save his
scene.
life, but she shows up in the battle scene, she saves his life, she gets her two boons, and then you kind of just flash forward and you get her exiling Ram and claiming her boons. But in the actual Ramayana, there's a little bit more about her. You do learn, for example, the fact that she has seven brothers, that her father exiled her mother. These are things that are in the original epic or in other versions of the epic. The bride price, the fact that Dashrath promises that her son, her blood son, will be king in order to get her hand in marriage, is actually in the original Ramayana. It's said that her blood price is like the heir to the kingdom, which essentially means that her son will be heir to the kingdom. So that's like a little detail that slipped into the original that is just never mentioned, but kind of puts all of her actions in a new light. So I think those little details that, it makes sense that they were omitted in all of the popular versions of the Ramayana because the story is not about her. She sort of kicks off the epic and she's gone. But when I was trying to piece together her life, there actually turned out to be several little details that I could build from.
I mean, it's not a surprise since it is such a male-dominated world, you know, around the world that, when this woman comes in and saves, you know, it becomes the hero. Of course, the hero who wants to be the center of the story just kind of marginalizes her and sets her to the side. So clearly you've done so much research, years and years of research. I've noticed over the years in bookselling and reading, various retellings, that there are a lot of these retellings, but there are different standards that are held for BIPOC authors. And they're often criticized that these retellings are overdone and unreasonable, and they have all these unreasonable expectations for research and justification for whatever changes the author decided to make. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's something that I've seen and sort of struggled with myself, where I did all of this research. I think that for the story I was trying to tell, where I was really changing and critiquing aspects of the original, it was a responsible thing to do all of this research and to have reasons behind my choices. But then I would get a lot of reader responses that just sort of assumed that I had not done my research and had not had any justifications for these changes. And I think that when we see what a lot of more like mainstream Western stories by white authors, the kind of treatment that they get is just sort of an assumption that this baseline has been satisfied. And I think a lot about what happened when Legendborn came out, which is a YA sort of Arthurian inspired retelling, and it's an amazing book. And there was just so much criticism for like, how could you make a black girl the center of a story about like Arthurian mythology, even though you could clearly see that it was like so lovingly crafted and that there were all of these like rich little details in there. So it's not just about me or any one retelling, but rather the way that I think systemically BIPOC authors just end up getting a lot more questions and a lot more skepticism that they sort of are expected to answer as a privilege of getting published that doesn't happen to white authors. And I think what I would like to see is a world in which we're all sort of presumed to have done the requisite research unless it's proven otherwise, and we get to like tell our stories to the same standards rather than having to spend so much time talking about these like little details, or having to defend ourselves from the perspective of like somebody coming to you and saying, how could you have made this change? Like, don't you know what it means? This isn't a legitimate retelling, which is, I think, the defensive position that a lot of BIPOC authors end up having to move from.
Yes, and just as an aside, the book Vaishnavi was referring to as Legendborn by Tracy Dion, and I would even tell you the manuscript I got in the mail the other day.
Wait.
I,
Amazing.
I could, go a little bit more onto that, but I'll just give a little,
Oh my gosh, look at that bookseller perk.
okay. So one of the things I found, I love her backstory. I really loved how you made her into a full and complete character, but you also showed that she really had no agency. She was ignored by her family other than her brother, who helped teach her all these skills, but it was really her own will that kind of moved her forward, and made her excel. I mean, she was just a natural diplomat. She's very caring. She uplifted marginalized women. How did those pieces end up coming together?
Yeah, so I think part of I part of my project was asking why did she do the things that she did, and that doesn't start with the exile. Really, to me, it started with the first big thing that she did, which is accompany her husband onto the battlefield and save his life. And if you ask why did she do that at a time where, there are some female warriors in myth, but there's very few, and they're always justified under some sort of exception. So you have to ask yourself, why did this princess, who had really no relation to any gods or any like famed warriors at this time, why was she able to like be his charioteer and save his life? And to me, the answer was because she wanted to. And so from there, you get to backfill all of these things that she's doing because she decides that she is going to do them. And I think that just became an essential part of her character, is that she's very willful and stubborn. And sometimes that's amazing because she's learning new skills and doing great things on behalf of her kingdom. And sometimes it's her worst trait because she refuses to believe that conflicts are not about her, or she refuses to believe that maybe she's like not what a situation needs at any given time. But I think that's like the wonderful thing about writing her character, is that it felt like everything sort of came naturally from those core character traits that she had. Um, and then when it comes to the Women's Council and all of that sort of work, I was thinking about how communities are uplifted or manage to make change. And, there's a lot of different theories about it. And you hear a lot about this, like the great person theory, which kind of not assumes, but like posits that it's these like great individual leaders who lead marginalized communities into a new era. But really, even if you dig into those stories, it's actually that a bunch of people from the community came together, and there was like strength in numbers and power in self-empowerment and empowering one another, and sort of as a collective they were able to overcome or change their situation. And I really wanted to show that on the page, because to me it would have been disingenuous to be telling a story where Kaikeyi sort of like single-handedly changes the lives of all the women in her kingdom. I mean, it would have certainly been cool, but I don't think that's how that change happened. So it's her and her fellow queens and her friends and the other servants, and it's really women empowering themselves, because if they have even the smallest opportunity, they're going to do so. And so that to me was sort of very important to portray, independent of Kaikeyi as a person.
And I think that's actually one of the things that has happened across societies throughout Asia, is that women do gather together, bond together, and do make change together. But since they had no voice back then, that those facts are kind of lost to history itself.
Absolutely. I think it's the question of what gets recorded. And I think it's very interesting that you bring that up, because with the Ramayana, there's not only a lot of written versions, which I was able to reference, but there's a lot of oral traditions that are passed specifically among women in communities that often center the women in the stories, or have the women saving the day or performing all these powerful feats. But it's so hard to get my hands on those stories because they're not recorded, or if they're recorded, they're not prioritized for translation or discussion, because it's just sort of oral tradition that's not recorded. And yet, that's probably how most people are accessing these stories. So it's a really it's both a beautiful thing that this exists and that this form of storytelling that's very female dominated is getting passed along and getting told, but it's also very frustrating from a research and scholarly perspective that it's it's not my research area academically, so I'm not able to like go out there and into the field and get these stories and translate them. I'm kind of reliant on what's been researched and written, and that tends to focus on the more male written, male dominated narratives.
So let's talk about the binding plane. I thought this concept was so fantastic and so original, but can you explain to the viewers what that binding plane is and its significance in the book?
Yeah, so the binding plane was sort of entirely my own invention because I love fantasy, and the Ramayana isn't exactly fantasy. It's historical, it's mythical, but it's also sort of a religious story that's believed to be history by many people. And I mean, for many reasons, wanted to include a fantasy element that was pure fantasy, both because I love the genre, but also because I kind of wanted to set it apart from the actual Ramayana. And I've always had this idea, just like this visual image of being able to see the bonds that connect you to other people. Like what would they look like? What would they represent about your connection to people? And so that was sort of how the idea for the binding plane came into existence, because so much of Kaikeyi's story is about relationships and about the way those change and evolve over time, and what can be done with relationships, and what the limit or extent of your control or influence on another person is, and free will. And so having a visual representation of all of these ideas to sort of illustrate on the page in a fantastical way was really, I think, very helpful. The very first outline I ever had of Kaikeyi did not have this element in it, and I just felt like there was something really missing. And so when I wrote it, I added this magical element in it, and it kind of just brought it all together, because you could see sort of thematically from the very beginning what the story was going to be about.
I love fantasy as well, but it's funny because I don't think of this book as a fantasy. Like in my books, in our bookstore, we don't shelve it in fantasy. We shelve it on the fiction wall with basically with the other retellings. Have you had pushback as to where do you think this book should go? Do you think it's under sci-fi fantasy, or do you think it's under fiction, or?
Yeah, I lean more fiction than fantasy. To me, it's like in a world in which like some fantasy is just reality, which is sort of the tack that all retellings take. And so adding this magical element, I don't think makes it fantasy, because it's not like the magical element is not critical to the story really. But I wanted to like fantasy is the genre that I love the most, so it's like sort of a blend. But if I had to pick one, I would put it in probably like fiction or historical fiction.
Yeah, see, to me, like if the other retellings, especially if the Greek retellings are shelved in fiction, then Kaikeyi should be in fiction as well, because they're just the same. They're just from different countries.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the role of, and I forgot to look up the pronunciation of this name, Mantra.
Mantra, yeah.
Yeah. Her role was very interesting in here because there were some slight differences from the original. How did you draw upon her character and expand on it from where she appeared in the epic?
Yeah, so in the epic, like Mantra is really the evil one. Like Kaikeyi is evil, jealous, motivated by sort of this like petty envy, but she would never have had the idea to exile Ram if Mantra hadn't told her to do it. In the epic, Mantra comes to Kaikeyi and basically tells her Ram is about to be coronated. If Ram is coronated, Kaushalya will be the queen mother, you'll be nothing, your son will be nothing, you have to fix the situation. And Kaikeyi, who up until that point was, perfectly content with how things were going, decides to go along with Mantra's saying and, ruin everyone's lives. And Mantra is not really explained. In some versions of the epic, it's implied that the gods influence her to do what she did because they want Ram to be exiled in order to achieve his destiny. But in a lot of versions, it's just like she did it because she was, loyal to Kaikeyi and nobody else and didn't like Ram. And I just think that all of these reasons of like, oh, she was just a jealous person, oh, she just didn't like so and so, is a really shallow reason. I mean, even if the reason is you don't like somebody, there's a reason why you don't like them. You don't just wake up one day and go, I really hate Ram. Like presumably something has happened to cause this. And so part of what I was trying to do with Kaikeyi is to explore the motivations of a lot of different characters that usually we just get told this was why they did it, and that explanation is like very one note. And so in showing Kaikeyi and Manthara's relationship from the start, because Manthara is really a stand-in mother figure for her, Manthara became a much more sort of sympathetic and loving character. And she is still very much Team Kaikeyi and nobody else. Like, you know, she would absolutely kill somebody for Kaikeyi and feel zero regret about it. But at least now you sort of see the loving and caring side of her. And when she makes recommendations, they're based on, you know, logical reasoning based on all of the events that she's seen in the past, rather than just waking up and deciding to ruin people's lives. So I really wanted to give her a similar amount of nuance to Kaikeyi.
I mean, the reality is it's a parent-child bond. While they may
Mm-hmm.
not be related by blood, there is definitely a parent-child bond between them, as well as Kaikeyi's relationship with her sons, whether it's a blood son or an adoptive son. But it was really hard, it seemed like, to balance her love for her sons, as well as, you know, what's going to happen with the greater good of society if Ram becomes king.
Yeah, definitely. I think a huge theme of a lot of ancient epics, a lot of Indian stories, and of Kaikeyi is this idea of family versus duty, especially with the, you know, Hindu idea of dharma, and, you know, you have a duty that you're put on the earth to do. Usually that somehow, in some way, tragically conflicts with what your family wants you to do or what you want to do for your family or for your loved ones. Um, and so people end up in these positions making these very difficult choices. And so I think Kaikeyi and Ram are both really struggling throughout this book to balance what they think their duty to their family is with what they think their duty to everyone else in the world is. And I don't think that either of them are right or wrong in which side they favor or how they go about doing it. I think that they're both influenced by their own personal experiences, because that's ultimately how we end up making these decisions. But the bond of family versus the duty to everyone else was sort of a central conflict that I was trying to explore.
And you can really tell that Kaikeyi really takes her duties and responsibility very seriously, including her marriage, even though she didn't want to get married to begin with. I did think a really interesting thing that came out in this book is Kaikeyi being aromantic and asexual. How did you come up with these themes and balancing that with a duty to her marriage?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, first, it's a very underrepresented identity in fiction, and it was important to me to portray that. But also, I think there was a reason why I thought it would be particularly appropriate for Kaikeyi to have this identity, which is that in the story, she's really portrayed as the like seductress archetype. Like she uses her womanly wiles on Dashrath to get what she wants. And again, I think that so many women in stories are portrayed this way. I think because sometimes um, you know, cis heterosexual men might interpret women's actions as that when that's not what they are at all. And so by putting us in Kaikeyi's head, in a Kaikeyi where this is not even a factor for her, you know, she's not thinking, oh, I'm going to like seduce Dashrath so I can get what I want. You really get to see her develop and use these other bonds. And I think, you know, asexual and aromantic people can have very meaningful relationships with other people. Like compulsory sexuality sort of hurts everyone, but that doesn't mean that, you know, aroace people can't love their friends as deeply as people love their romantic partners or love their children as deeply or any of that. And so portraying Kaikeyi as just a normal person who has all of these other loving relationships, and even her relationship with her husband is one of, you know, deep friendship and respect, and they both love each other if in different ways. I just wanted to show that just sort of happening naturally. Like to her, it's not a big deal.
So as much as I want to keep chatting over this, I probably should address some of the questions. We have some pre-submitted questions. One is from, and forgive the pronunciation, Shmuti Sentil. Their question is, what was your hardest obstacle to overcome while creating the story from Kaikeyi's perspective?
Yeah, so I think the hardest obstacle when writing it was, I mean, not exactly an obstacle, but trying to overcome the like lack of information and decide what the most appropriate way to make stuff up was in a way that was both like thematically appropriate, but also could have been in some ways historically accurate. I think that was tough. I think once I got into the publication process for me, some of the hardest parts were dealing with a lot of the like extreme, I don't want to say, I don't know how exactly to put this, but like extreme religious criticism that I got, which was like, how could you write about this myth? Like, this is like anti-Hindu, all of these comments that I got, which is like, I'm Hindu, I grew up with these stories, like I'm writing this out of a place of respect. But there are people out there who feel like we can't alter or retell these stories at all, and to do so is like sacrilegious or blasphemous. And I wasn't expecting to get like that sort of like online hate, especially of people being like, I'm going to do awful things to you because you wrote this story. So that was like mentally a very tough obstacle to overcome. But now I'm at the point where I just happily block and move on with my life.
I also did see some criticism about how can you basically rehabilitate Kaikeyi's image when she's such an evil person. And I think those people just lost perspective as to who told the original epic. Of course, whoever told the original epic is going to make Ram look good and villainize everyone else. And this is just another point of view to show what happened from that point of view.
Yeah, and I think I got a lot of hate as well, because if Kaikeyi is sort of rehabilitated, there has to be a reason why she's exiling Ram. Therefore, Ram has to be somebody less than perfect. And to me, Ram's character was always somebody less than perfect, because as much as he wants to do the right thing, in the Ramayana itself, he doubts Sita's chastity. He exiles her because she's lived in the house of another man. He's not always making 100% correct decisions, and he struggles with duty to his family versus duty to his subjects and what his subjects believe. And so the Ram that I write is a sort of teenage version of that character, where he's struggling with a lot of the same things. Like, do I believe what my family is telling me, or do I believe what my subjects are telling me? And by the end of the story, he is a young man who has now learned to think for himself and sort of grown up and matured. And so to me, like, I think that that's in some ways, I think a more commendable thing to have done than to just be born perfect and be absolutely perfect from the start. But I think that some people didn't see it that way, and so they were really upset about that.
Well, especially now in today's age, studies have shown that young people, especially young men, their frontal lobes don't really develop until they're much older. So his actions are a lot more understandable coming from Kaikeyi's point of view, because he was so young then and he didn't have the best judgment. And I think there would have been more outrage if you had rehabilitated Ravan, who kidnapped Sita.
Yeah, I think Robin's a hard character because he appears so little in the book. And when I was writing this book, I was like, wow, this is this very creepy and sinister guy. And Kaikeyi is just sort of blinded to it, because I hope that I was writing Kaikeyi as a somewhat flawed character who has her blind spots. And then I was sort of shocked to get all these comments about like, how could you make Robin such a great guy? He's like a terrible person. And I was like, but he's a crazy power hungry demon in this book too. So I think it's, a matter of interpretation. It possibly means that I, as the author, did not like make that explicit enough on the page. But it's also just a matter, like every reader has their own interpretation of every story they read. And so that was sort of like, to me, I was not trying to really rehabilitate Robin. I was, his relationship with Sita is more akin to some of the alternate versions of the Ramayana that are more common in Southeast Asia, where he has a different relationship with her. But ultimately, his arrogance and his greed is still his downfall in every version of the story that you read. And I was trying to put that in Kaikeyi, but jury's out.
So another pre-submitted question from Rualini Magdahushi, as well as our anonymous attendee, they basically want to know what you'll write next.
Yeah, so I'm hoping for sometime next year. I don't think I can say more than that, but I am working on another myth retelling. This one tells a very small part of the Mahabharata, which is the other sort of major Indian epic, But if you think the Ramayana is big, at least it follows sort of one narrative. The Mahabharata follows like a million narratives and a million different people, and you're reading it and you're like, oh my God, wait, I think we're like 4 generations back right now. Like, when are we going to flash forward again? So it's a much smaller portion of the Mahabharata that I'm retelling relative to the portion of the Ramayana that I retold. But it follows another female character in the Mahabharata who gets not necessarily a bad rap, but at the very least a very confused rap. And tells her story. So I'm currently working on that, hopefully for 2023.
So May would like to know, who is your favorite author?
Oh my gosh, that's a really, really hard question. I don't think I can answer that, but I'll say I can like name some books that I have read recently and really enjoyed. So I was mentioned earlier, I'm a huge science fiction and fantasy reader. So my favorite like fantasy series ever is Fonda Lee's Greenbone Saga, Jade City, Jade War, Jade Legacy. I could never write a book like that, but like I'm obsessed. So I love those books. I recently finished Ava Reed's Juniper and Thorn, which is sort of like a dark fantasy horror. That was excellent. And then a book that I'm looking forward to that I got to read in blurb is Monsters Born and Made, which is coming out in September, I believe. And that is a South Asian inspired sort of like Hunger Games-esque fantasy. And it has a really, really great and like thoughtful portrayal of caste in it. So I just like adored that book.
I just
And
have
that
to
one's
go
by
back.
Tanvi Barwa.
I just have to go back to Fonda Lee and her trilogy.
Oh my God.
If you haven't read it, you really need to. And also, like, so much time goes by and you really see these characters grow as well.
Kilo. Like me reading Jade Legacy in like one day just to find out what happened to this one character. That's like 700-page book. So
Yeah, it's a very satisfying trilogy.
it covers so many years, and yet it manages to keep you tense. Like your favorite character could still die at any moment, even though the trilogy covers like 50 years. That's really hard to do.
And just like the Binding Plane, it has pretty original magic in there as well. And it seems so real, and you just kind of get drawn into the world itself.
Absolutely.
What are you going to be reading next?
I'm trying to like see what it is. But I am about to finish The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, which I'm really loving. It's kind of like Mexican Gothic, but then also not really. Kind of like Rebecca is another good comp for it, but it's like Gothic horror set in 1800s Mexico. And then next up, I have The Change, which I don't know very much about. But I have just like heard really good things about it. It's like women getting magic and like investigating a murder is how my friend pitched it to me when she told me to pick it up.
How have you been finding the writing community? Like, have you been able to be active in it given that you've been in school the last few years?
Yeah, so I think that a bigger obstacle compared to being in school has really been the pandemic, because I think a lot of at least the adult science fiction and fantasy writing community used to be based a lot on like cons and gatherings and things like that, which I really haven't had the chance to participate in. But I was in Pitch Wars, so that was really great for finding a community of writers who are sort of in a similar stage of their journey with me, and a group of us have sort of stayed in contact for, at this point, like 3 years, and sort of been with each other through that process. And then I'm in New Haven, Connecticut right now, and there's some other authors in New Haven as well. So I've been able to meet up with them, which has been really nice.
So we have another question. Someone wants to know how bar sitting is going.
You have to attack me like this. It's going okay. I mean, how well can bar studying really go? I've got a month left, so I feel like I'm still in the zone where I keep telling myself like, oh, I have time to get it in shape, but we'll see.
You have time to get it in shape. It's really just an endurance test is what it comes down to.
Yeah, like, because it's 2 days, which I've never taken a 2-day long exam before. I don't know. My husband he does medical physics, so he has to take like boards to practice medicine. And so he's like, the bar does not sound that bad to me. And I'm like, nobody asked you for your input.
Well, we're coming down to the end of our time. Do you have any last words you want to say to our audience?
I think we covered a lot of great topics, but it was lovely to be here. Thank you for your questions. I had a blast. And if you have any other questions or you think of anything, you can find me on social media at Vaishna Writes, Vaishna Writes, on Twitter or Instagram. I think we might have gotten another. Oh,
We have one more question, which is one more pitch for Fonda Lee, Fondalee, and the trilogy is Jade City, then Jade War, then Jade Legacy, because the world expands as each book goes on.
yes.
So, Kaikeyi, oh, that's much better. It's a beautiful cover as well. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for having me.